We've now reached a hinge in this course. Yes, we'll still see plenty more sculpture and architecture. Yes, we've already seen many paintings, but with the Renaissance and with the development of new tools, such as linear perspective, new materials such as oil paint and paper, new markets for a wider variety of subjects, and a new embrace of individual artistic vision, well, painting is going to come into its own. So this is a good point to pause briefly to help you fill your analytical toolbox. What should you be looking at when you look at paintings? I'm not going to read these analytical slides, by the way. We have too much ground to cover. But hang on to these notes since we will return to these questions again and again. Let's practice on the very first painting in this unit. What is this painting about? And why might this subject matter be significant? You all know the story. The three wise men or magi visit the Christ child. But why might this subject be significant to Gentile's patron, Paolo Strozzi, the wealthiest Florentine of his day? Well, the people in this painting clearly are not Franciscans set on renouncing their worldly goods. Just look at those elegant clothes and beautiful horses. On the one hand, this painting, as your textbook puts it, quote, sanctifies the aristocracy in the presence of the Madonna and Child, unquote. But I would guess that the patron also wanted the artist to emphasize that even the wealthy, even the powerful would bow before Christ, the patron included. Our next set of tools falls under the broad category of style, the techniques a painter employs to build a painting. So let's go back to Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi. The term international style sums up a number of style choices. What are some of these? Well, two international style elements that this painting clearly displays are sumptuous court dress and extensive use of gold and expensive pigments, both reflecting the wealthy aristocratic consumers of this art. But this painting is also significant because it represents a transition between medieval and Renaissance artistic styles. What Renaissance style elements do you see? Well, look at the horse's rump in the bottom right-hand corner. What technique has the artist used to convey where the horse stands in space? Well, the horse's behind is foreshortened. The animals in general are more naturalistic. The human faces show individuality. The light, too, seems to have a definite source, the Christ child, not just some amorphous heavenly light. The painting conveys movement. Right up, I would argue, to the point where the Magi confront the Christ child, where the movement seems to stop. Content addresses the subject of the painting. Context addresses why the artist pursued this subject and these techniques. What's happening in the culture that helps impel this kind of art? I've zoned in on a portion of this picture to help us answer these context questions. We don't actually know that much about Gentile da Fabriano, other than that he worked for wealthy patrons and that he was influenced by the Sienese school, including Duccio. We do know that the patron was very, very rich, and that the patron almost certainly chose the subject for the painting he commissioned. Art historians seem to agree that the patron shows up in the wealthy crowd descending on the stable, but they disagree about which individual is actually Paolo Strozzi. I've circled the most commonly identified candidate, but we actually don't really know. What we do know is that this subject was very popular in the merchant cities of Italy. Any thoughts about why? I've actually already talked about this a little bit. Again, remember that the rising merchant classes were ambivalent about their wealth. Franciscans were the most popular preachers in Italian cities. The church condemned lending money at interest, yet the scripture describes men of wealth and power who worship the Savior without, as far as we know, renouncing their worldly goods. No surprise that they are popular with Florentine merchants. And finally, what purpose did the painting serve? Who would view it? What did the artist or patron hope to achieve with this work? Artists did not, at this point, expect their works to hang in museums. There weren't any museums yet. So what was the function of this work? Actually, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's an altarpiece, more than 9 feet tall and 9 feet wide, in fact. So what reaction was the artist looking for? And again, you need to think about not only the colors and the materials, but the sheer size. Looking for awe, presumably that even the rich and powerful would bow before Christ and awe, let's face it, at the spectacular colors, all that gold, and the wealth and power of the patron than the church that it represents. As for the patron, again, he wanted to display his wealth and piety and remind worshipers that rich guys could get to heaven too. So don't be too tough on us, right? Now let's take the same questions and apply them to a much more important work, a work that the College Board frequently asks questions about, so consider that a warning. This is Tribute Money by Masaccio. The painting was one of many frescoes in a private chapel commissioned by the Brancacci family. The chapel is often compared with the Arena Chapel in Padua with its paintings by Giotto. Remember that before Christmas break? And Masaccio was clearly influenced by Giotto's style. He also moved beyond Giotto, and many art historians view him as the founding painter of the Italian Renaissance. The subject of the painting is a story that appears only in the book of Matthew, a story that had already been depicted in art, had rarely been depicted in art. The Apostle Peter was challenged by a tax collector. Did this Jesus fellow pay the temple tax? In the dialogue that follows, you can check it out in Matthew 17, Jesus tells Peter, quote, "What do you think, Simon?" And Simon replies, Jesus continues, "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?" Peter answers, "From others." "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him, "but so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it for my tax and yours." So the content is a religious narrative. The context is more debated, but some art historians think that the patron or the artist wanted to express support for taxes that Florentine officials were collecting to raise money for the defense of Florence, a city that was constantly under attack and threat of invasion. We don't even know whether it was Brancacci or Masaccio who chose this particular subject. The function was to aid family devotions, as this was a private chapel, which is a little hard to reconcile with the idea that this was partly a political message. Again, there's a lot we don't know about this painting. But what really makes this painting important to art history is its style, the way Masaccio chose to build the painting. The fresco contains 3 separate parts of the story, all shown in the same frame as a continuous narrative. You'll see I've circled them. In the center, we see Jesus debating with his disciples. Peter is the fellow with the beard. To our left, Peter pulls a coin from the fish's mouth. I've blown this up to make it clearer. And on the right, we see Peter paying the tax collector. The continuous narrative is a more medieval style, by the way. Masaccio's fully modeled figures, however, like Giotto's, you see that comparison here, have volume and weight. But Masaccio goes beyond Giotto in several regards. What do you see in this painting that moves beyond the Proto-Renaissance? One answer, labeled here, is Masaccio's use of aerial perspective. Note that the mountains are blurrier, lighter, and bluer than the action in the foreground. I apologize for my continuous throat clearing. Another even more important answer is the use of mathematical perspective. Masaccio was a close friend of Brunelleschi's and knew his studies of perspective very well. Note that the orthogonals converge on Christ's head. Masaccio also made far more use of contrasts of light and dark to define volume and space. The term for this is chiaroscuro. Here's an illustration of this very important term. This is one you must know. You'll surely remember this extraordinarily evocative Adam and Eve from Sister Wendy's video. The photo on the right gives you a sense of where both tribute money and the expulsion of Adam and Eve in the garden, on the left, fit into the scheme of the chapel overall. Note the similarity between Masaccio's Venus and Praxiteles' Venus. Masaccio would have seen copies of this statue. They littered Italy. Masaccio did not originally get the commission for the Brancacci chapel. It went to Masolino, who was a well-known painter in the international Gothic tradition, similar to Gentile da Fabriano. This painting is not in your textbook, but it is part of the Brancacci chapel frescoes, and I think it provides an interesting contrast. What differences do you see in the 2 depictions of Adam and Eve? Well, I would note not only the far greater emotional depth of Masaccio's painting, which Sister Wendy emphasized, but also you see the use of chiaroscuro, you see a much greater sense of movement, and the portrayal of Adam and Eve as three-dimensional figures in the three-dimensional space, something that art historians often refer to as modeling. This painting is even more famous for its exquisitely careful use of perspective. I'll get there in a moment, but first let's look at the content, context, and function. The subject is the Trinity. God the Father holds up God the Son with God the Spirit as a dove descending on Christ's head. The viewer's eye is drawn up to the figures of the Trinity, but also down to that skeletal memento mori below the figures, which served as a reminder of depth. The deep recess, entirely a pictorial illusion, this is all done with paint, there's no sculpture here, or architecture, draws the viewer into the scene and therefore directly into communion with the triune God. Individuals are very much participants in this religious scene, not just viewers. The perspectival composition of this painting is extraordinarily accurate and extraordinarily complex. Note that the composition is based on a series of triangles, itself a representation of the Trinity, the three sides. Also note that the patrons are larger than the figures of Mary and John at the base of the cross. That since they are closer to us in space, they should be larger. But again, this is the opposite of hierarchy of scale. Optical perspective has replaced conceptual perspective. Again, you've already heard Sister Wendy discuss this. There we go. Again, you've already heard Sister Wendy discuss this painting, so just a few additional notes. This division of interior and exterior space was typical of Giotto's frescoes as well. The open courtyard in which the angel confronts Mary was and still is called a loggia. That term sometimes shows up on the AP exam. You'd want to be able to identify this interior as late Gothic or Renaissance. So, what's happened to the halo in this picture? It's almost disappeared. Like Giotto's Madonna, these figures have weight and substance. But this Mary and baby are much more human, even more sensual. You may recall from the Medici video that Fra Lippi was not exactly a saint. A Fra Angelico he was not, although his Mary has some of the same sweetness as Fra Angelico's, and I've reproduced Giotto's Madonna and Throne to give you some basis of comparison. So far, we have looked entirely at religious paintings, but the Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement, the admiration of the Roman portrait statues, and the growing patronage of a wealthy merchant class all created a demand for portraits. So here are two paintings by the Florentine painter Ghirlandaio. The one on the left appears in your book, the one on the right doesn't, but I really like it. Note again how much individual personality even the rather austere profile of the portrait conveys, although I would say that the man shows more personality than the woman, which is true of a lot of Renaissance portraiture. We've been practicing close reading of content, style, context, and function. I'd like to give you a break now and let you hear someone else's analysis of some famous paintings, or precisely two. Let's start with this painting, which is one of a series commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent. I want you to watch a brief video on how Uccello uses perspective to bring order to a chaotic battlefield scene. This is part, by the way, of a longer video on this piece, one of the Private Lives of a Masterpiece BBC series that you'll be seeing more of. A link to the full video will be available on Moodle if you're interested. I'm going to end this lecture with works by Sandro Botticelli. There's more painting to cover in this chapter, but I think you've had enough to absorb in one sitting. You all recognize this painting, right? Botticelli was another of the many painters who lived on commissions from the Medici. This work is tempera on canvas, and it tells how Venus was born out of the sea foam and carried on a cockle shell to her sacred island. Actually, the story is a little more gruesome than that. Incest and castration are involved. You can check out the original account from the ancient Greek author Hesiod at this link, which will be on Moodle as well, but consider that I have issued a parental advisory. Botticelli was far less obsessed with mathematical perspective than his Florentine contemporaries, and far more fascinated with classical mythology. In some ways, Botticelli's work seems closer to the International Gothic style, but his use of chiaroscuro, his clearly modeled bodies, and above all, the dramatic movement all set his work apart as Renaissance. Botticelli is also known as a master of line. You'll see this even more clearly when we get to the Primavera, which is a painting that is not in your textbook, but that we're going to look at some length if you have time, since I can share a very good video analyzing the painting. But first, let's look at a few other paintings by Botticelli, who has a very distinctive style. The statue on the left is the Venus de' Medici, or the Modest Venus, a 1st century BCE Hellenistic copy, perhaps of a work by Praxiteles. The statue was one of the Medici family's prized possessions. Do you notice a resemblance? Excuse me. We've already noted that the Adoration of the Magi was a popular subject with Florence's merchant patrons. The patron who commissioned this piece was a banker related to the Medici, who was also well known for his shady financial practices, so a little atonement may be going on here. The architect and art historian Vasari raves about how Botticelli captured the individual personalities of the people in this painting. And the reason that's so interesting is that we know that many of the personalities are in fact those of Medici's identifiable historical personages. So, the older man kneeling in front of the Virgin is Cosimo de' Medici, who was actually dead by the time this painting was done. The arrogant young man on the left is his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the figure on the right looking out at the viewer is probably, though not certainly, Botticelli himself. Here's a closer look at a couple of those portraits. You'll notice that Botticelli's beautiful women all bear a certain resemblance to each other, although no actual model has ever been identified. This painting, along with the Birth of Venus and Primavera, which we'll see in a moment, are sometimes referred to as furniture paintings or even bedroom furniture paintings. They were private paintings intended for the bedroom. The long, narrow shape easily fits over a bed. Venus was, of course, married to the god Mars, although it looks like she's the conqueror in this picture. I'll leave it to your imagination just what activity conquered Mars. And in that spirit, let's turn to one of Botticelli's most famous bedroom paintings, one that, rather unaccountably to my mind, is left out of your textbook. These final video clips come from another of the Private Lives of a Masterpiece series, and this one is on Botticelli's Primavera. One of the things I worry about with this course is that we cover too many works and therefore don't have an opportunity to look at any of them in the depth that they deserve. This is why I like this BBC series so much. I don't know how much time you'll have at the end of class, but here are some selected clips. The first clip introduces this painting. The second clip shows how Botticelli both drew on and transformed the conventions of Christian art. In the third clip, you'll learn about the context for the painting. An arranged marriage with perhaps reluctant participants who needed a little encouragement to fulfill their dynastic responsibilities. The encouragement is disturbingly violent, at least it's disturbing to me. Again, consider yourselves warned. This video also contains interesting segments on Botticelli's rather wild life, on his relationship with the Medicis, and on the symbolism of the flowers. For more time. Check it out if you have time and are interested.